evening, and thank you for coming. I wanted to start tonight by talking about a trip my family and I took when I was in middle school. Um, my family and I were blessed enough to be able to go on a trip to Disney World. And when I mean my family and I mean myself, my brothers and sisters, which were four of us plus me, um, and my mother and father. And by I went to Disney World, I mean we got in the back of a minivan and we took a trip from San Antonio, Texas, all the way down to Florida. And we took this trip in 2 days. And when we got to Florida, we went underneath the ark that told us we were going to Disney World. We were listening to Disney radio, and we found that what we had seen in the movies was only a fraction of what there was. Whether it was the lights or the attractions, whether it was the rides there, the people dressed in real-life, three-dimensional characters of Disney was almost more than a child of my age could bear. These things that I had been watching as a child were now in front of me, and I was able to enjoy them in 360-degree joy. And this trip, unfortunately, I wish it could have taken forever, unfortunately lasted only a matter of days. And we have found ourselves packing the minivan yet again to take our trip back to San Antonio. And my father had a great idea. I see now that it was a great idea, but he thought that we should take a trip and do it all in one leg. And typically we would just drive part of a leg there, and we'd spend sometimes sleeping. We'd drive 8 hours to Disney World. So into this trip, we get 6 or 7 hours in. We've taken the required amount of breaks for children of our age. We've eaten, and all is well so far. We get 10 to 12 hours in, and that's about the threshold that we have. That's about when we would stop. And so far, no major things have happened. And then we are 16, 17 hours in, and my co-riders, who were people that we had just enjoyed much amazement with, are now becoming the enemy. We are now poking at each other, becoming more annoyed with each other, starting to pull each other's hair and do things that kids will do when they start to become annoyed. 20 hours in, my mother and father are now excited that we are now nearing the end of our trip in San Antonio to the house, and I cannot tell you how much I regret that situation. And if I could go back, I would change the way in which I acted. And I don't know today if you have ever been on such a trip where you were leading a trip that was meant to be fun and full of joy, and the people that you brought along became a grumbling bunch. People that were meant to have fun are now whining and complaining, and you're wishing the trip was over. Maybe today you are one of those people who have unfortunately been the complainer, the whiner, the person who was making it horrible for the trip leader. Whether you've been one or both of those people today, I wanted to see what God has to say about that. And we find our text today in Exodus, the 15th and 16th chapter, Exodus 15:22, and all the way through the end of Exodus 16. And it's in this book that we find one of the most miraculous acts that God does in the Old Testament, in the releasing of the children of Israel from the bondage of slavery in Egypt. And this is not just any act, but it's a act that only God can do. And he does this in a number of different acts, whether it is through the locusts or whether it is through darkness and turning water into blood, and ultimately the death of a firstborn. And then he opens the Red Sea and the people walk through, and he closes it in on their pursuits. And we see the opening of Acts chapter 15. The first half of it is what the Israelites will do throughout the Old Testament whenever God acts in a miraculous way for them, in a way that they could not do on their own for themselves. They sing. They sing a song from verses 1 through verses 21 from Moses and Aaron's sister Miriam. Moses and Miriam, are acting as choir leaders, and they are singing the praises of God and what he was capable of doing and what he is still capable of doing today. And they are singing and enjoying on the banks of the Red Sea, and it is from the text of 1 through 21 that we jump from Moses and Miriam to Moses and Mara in verse 22. The people of Israel, we pick up from them, have jumped or walked 3 days, a total of 41 miles and change, step by arduous step, in the desert. They are walking. If you've ever had this pleasure of walking in sand, you know that sand gives more than it does on dry land, and it makes it much harder, and you use much more muscle and energy than you would if you were walking on dry land, on land that is solid underfoot. And it is here that they find that as they are looking at their water, the water is becoming lower and lower, and they are now counting each drop as each thirsty gulp goes down a throat. And they are seeing that their water count is running low, and they come to a place in Mara which has much water in it. And they have much joy, but that joy is cut short, for that water is not good for the human body. That water is very bitter. And when I say that it's bitter, I don't mean that it's just a little sour, but it is incredibly sour. It is so bitter that when you drink this water, that your lips kiss your tongues. And what do the people of Israel do when faced with such trial? But grumble. They grumble, and this verb that is used in the Hebrew will come up multiple times throughout our text today, because this is the attitude that they share for the most part. An attitude of grumbling and complaining. And when they come to Moses and Aaron and point their finger at them and say, "You brought us to this place. We have no water. What are you going to do about it?" So Moses and Aaron wring their hands. They look up to the sky like any godly leader would do and say, "God, we cannot do this on our own. We have no way of supplying water to the people." And God acts in a way in which only God can act. And he supplies some wood for Moses. And we don't know much about this wood except for the fact that this wood, when placed in the waters of Mara, which is known as bitterness, becomes sweetness. It becomes sweet to the taste, and it gives life to the people of Israel. And this text will find its fullest completeness when we find much later in the book of the Bible, in John chapter 4, where Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman and is talking about water coming from a well. And he tells her that he is a well supply, a water of life that multiplies upon the receiver. And it is from Mara that they traveled to Elim. And Elim is a place described at the end of chapter 15 as a place that has much water, much palms, and I would assume much rest. They have shade, they have water, and they have a break from their trip from the Red Sea up into the Promised Land. So they come from Elim and they take another trek. The trek is now about 50 miles into the valley of Sin. And this is about partway in between the town of Elim and the Mount Sinai, where Moses will get the Ten Commandments. And it is here that we have our second major event. We pick up 5 days into a 2-month journey from the Red Sea. The people have walked over 90 miles by foot. They have seen the Lord give them water miraculously from bitterness into sweetness. And they now find another reason to become a dripping water to Moses and Aaron. They find another reason to be that annoying voice in the back of the caravan. It is not water this time that they are now rationing, but is now food. The food that they brought from Egypt, the food that they've been finding and collecting throughout the desert is starting to dwindle. They find themselves in the wilderness, and they find themselves with a lack of food. So what do these people do? These children of Israel. But grumble and complain again. They turn to Moses and Aaron and say, "It would have been better if the Lord had not removed us from the land of Egypt." They are less than 2 months into a journey, and they are already regretting being taken from slavery. And they say, well, at least in Egypt we had pots of meats and we had bread that we could eat to our filling. Yeah, we were slaves. Yeah, we had to work and sweat. Yeah, we had to build these pyramids that were back-breaking torture, but at least we had food in our belly. So Moses and Aaron are off, just broken, and they are sitting there and they do not know what to do. And they turn to the Lord as godly leaders yet again, and they say, "God, what do we do?" And yet again, God steps up and says, "They want meat, I will give them meat. Tell them to look by the evening and they will see quail." And the people do see quail. The text says that the quail cover the camp, and they are able to catch these quail so tame and miraculously supplied that they are able to eat them by night. But God is not done there in supplying the meat, but he's also there to supply the bread as well. So there we see that he supplies what chapter 16 verse 31 will describe as something that looks like a flaky white material, much like the seed of coriander. And he supplies it in the morning, and the people come out and they look at it, and they say manna, a Hebrew question meaning what is it? For they had not seen it before. And Moses explains, "This is what the Lord is supplying to you. You will pull it up from the ground. You can cook it, bake it, fry it, however you may prepare it, but it will be your bread supply." And they they pull that bread and they cook it. And this verse 15 and on, is where we have the introduction of Sabbath situation. We have the collecting of bread, and we have that one day of rest and the introduction of that day of rest. And it is from this question, manna, that we find that it is called manna, the bread which God supplied from the heavens. But this bread that God supplies from the heavens will not find its fullest completion, its fulfillment, until John chapter 6, verse 35, where God declares, "I am the bread of life, come down from heaven, broken for you." And it is this manna that they find, they pull and they eat. But Moses is not content with them just eating the quail and getting the manna, but he turns to Aaron and he tells Aaron, grab some of this manna, scoop it up, put it in a jar, and place it as a presentation before the people, so that they can remember what God has done for them in the valley of sin. We even see in chapter 16, verse 34, that he put it before the testimony that it might be kept, and it was preserved miraculously in the jar. And we see from the author in verse 35 that the Israelites ate manna for 40 years until the day that they would cross from the desert into the land of Canaan, the promised land. God did not just supply them for a short period of time, but continued to supply for decades on end. It's from this text that we find a major concept, a thesis for Moses when he was writing it down. That when we focus on our trials, on our struggles, that we eclipse the blessing that God is doing for us. Maybe you are working in a place in which the co-workers or the boss make it very hard for you to enjoy your job. Maybe you have just gotten out of a relationship or are struggling in a relationship, and it is just too hard for you. Maybe you're working through school, you're working and you just don't know how you're going to make ends meet. Or maybe you have a loved one that has been taken from you too soon in your point of view. It would be so easy to focus on these troubles, and lose sight of what God is doing for us. Much like the Israelites did in the town of Marah and the valley of sin. We allow these trials to become an eclipsing of God's blessing for us. Now, I'm not saying ignore them, much like the water and food. They are something that is a very real need. Something that needs to be met, something that has to be dealt with. So I'm not saying for one part to be like an ostrich and stick your head into the sand and ignore your trials. Nor am I saying, on the other hand, to focus so much on not focusing on your trials that all you do is focus on your trials. What I'm challenging you to do today, when you are going through these times, when you have a loved one that has passed from you, or you are struggling in your work, to focus on the blessings of God. Much like Moses did through Aaron for the people of Israel, and he presented the blessing that God had given them throughout, before the testimony. That you focus on what God has done for you within the past year. I challenge you to try and outright the blessings God has done for you. So whether you have a loved one who has gone, focus on the fact that God had given him or her that time in your life. That is through that person that you have found life. Whether it is through that job that you are struggling with and the coworkers are unbearable, that you would see that God has moved miraculously in the selecting of yourself. You may have been suited for that job, but God blesses the choices that your boss would make in your hiring. So tonight, I ask of you to write out the blessings that God has given for you in detail until you can write no more. For it is in the blessings of God that we may overcome many trials that we see in our life. Thank you for your time.